The second note didn't ask for money. It said she was dead. That is not a ransom note. That is a confession. An incomplete one. A confession without a name, without an address, without the full accounting that a family and an investigation need. But a confession nonetheless. Something happened, she's gone, it was buried, it was not meant to go this way. Named sources, confirmed contacts on the record. This is Missing People Files. Subscribe right now if you are new here and turn on your notifications. A source close to this investigation has confirmed what that second note said. A retired FBI special agent has analyzed every piece of what follows. And Savannah Guthrie's Instagram video now makes a different kind of terrible sense. Let's get into it. A source close to the investigation, a source confirmed as credible with direct proximity to the case, not an anonymous tipster or someone interpreting second-hand accounts, has confirmed the contents of the second note sent to a local Tucson television station in the Nancy Guthrie case. This is not aggregated reporting from other outlets, not a composite of conflicting accounts. This is direct confirmation. This is direct confirmation from a source with first-hand proximity to the investigation, at a moment when other outlets have been publishing conflicting accounts of what the note said. According to that source, the note said Nancy Guthrie died and was buried with nature now. Savannah Guthrie has said publicly that she believes the notes, or at least some of them, are real. That statement, made carefully in public by a family being advised by the FBI, is not accidental. It keeps a line of communication open. It signals to whoever sent the genuine notes that the family received them and is still listening. It indicated the death was not intentional. It did not offer a direct apology. And it explains, finally, after weeks of confusion, why the news director of that television station refused to call it a ransom note when she appeared on News Nation. Because it wasn't one. The contents of that second note have now been confirmed. A retired FBI agent with decades of kidnapping cases behind him has analyzed every piece of this. And Savannah Guthrie's Instagram video, the one where she said, "We received your message and we understand," now makes a different kind of terrible sense. Let's get into it. Before the note, before the analysis, before any of what follows, this is who this case is about. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She was taken from her home in Tucson, Arizona on an ordinary night, not a dramatic night, not a night with any obvious precursor or warning that something was about to happen. A person who appears on surveillance footage, whose face has been seen by investigators and the public for more than 135 days, has not been publicly identified, has not been charged, has not been named. She was sharp, politically engaged, digitally active, someone her family has described as present and aware and very much alive in the fullest sense of the word. She was not a passive person. She was not someone whose age made her less present in the world. If anything, by her family's account, she was more engaged at 84 than many people half her age. She was not a frail woman diminished by age. She was, in the way her family has spoken about her publicly, someone you would expect to fight back, to make noise, to be found. She was not someone who would simply disappear without a trace, not without a fight, not without making enough noise that someone would have heard something, if the disappearance had been anything other than a controlled, deliberate act by someone who came to that house with a plan. And yet, her daughter is Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognizable journalists in the country, a face that appears on national television every morning, someone whose public profile and stated willingness to pay anything have made this case visible in a way most families of missing persons never achieve. What happens to a family when the framing of their nightmare shifts from "she might still be alive" to "the note said she was buried"? For months, the public framing of this case has been built around the possibility of return, around tips and searches, and a family that has said publicly they will pay whatever it takes to bring Nancy home or get her back, dead or alive, just to know. That framing has just shifted. Not because of what law enforcement said at a press conference. The Pima County Sheriff's Office has said almost nothing publicly for months. Not because of a search that found something, or a body recovered, or a forensic confirmation of identity from a medical examiner. Because of a note, a piece of paper or digital communication sent to a television station by the person or people who took Nancy Guthrie, that a source close to this investigation has now confirmed said she died. That she was buried with nature. That it was not intentional. The family has known for weeks what that note said. They received it. The FBI received it. They processed it, analyzed it, built investigative strategy around it. And Savannah Guthrie made a video that, knowing what was in the note, reads as something entirely different from the public plea it appeared to be at the time. That she was buried with nature. That it was not intentional. The family has known this for weeks, possibly months. They have been living inside that knowledge. processing a grief that cannot fully be expressed publicly because the investigation is ongoing, because the people responsible have not been found, because giving in to that grief completely might close the door on whatever slim possibility remains. They have been asked to hold on to hope they may not actually have in public for an audience, because the alternative might let whoever did this feel safe enough to disappear entirely. And the rest of us are only now beginning to understand what Savannah's video was actually responding to, and what it cost her to record it. The sequence of notes in this case has been confusing from the beginning. Multiple notes, different television stations, conflicting characterizations, TMZ receiving notes that may or may not match what the local stations received, a California man arrested for a fraudulent ransom scheme exploiting the family's grief. The confusion matters because it speaks directly to the credibility of every piece of communication attributed to whoever took Nancy Guthrie. Not everything that has been called a ransom note in this case is a ransom note. Moore believes only 2 or 3 of the notes, across all of them, are genuine. The rest are opportunists who saw a national story and inserted themselves into it. The first note arrived at a local Tucson television station and was described, by the station, by investigators, and by the family, as a ransom note in the traditional sense. A demand, a price, a conditional offer made by people claiming to hold Nancy and be willing to return her in exchange for payment. The station's news director characterized it that way publicly, and nobody disputed that characterization at the time. The news director described it in those terms publicly without qualification. The second note arrived later. When that same news director appeared on News Nation, she specifically declined to call the second note a ransom note. She would not use the same characterization. She said the first note she would call a ransom note. The second she would not. At the time, that distinction seemed like a matter of professional precision or legal caution. Now it reads like exactly what it was. A news director who had read both notes and understood that the second one was categorically different from the first. She would not categorize it the way she had categorized the first. At the time, that distinction looked like professional caution. Now it is the entire story. According to a source close to the investigation, a source confirmed as credible and close enough to know, the second note said Nancy Guthrie died. That she was buried with nature now. That her death was not intentional. It did not contain a direct apology, though it acknowledged the death was unintentional. There was no demand. There was no price. There was no deadline, no account number, no instruction for where to send the cryptocurrency or how to make the transfer. There was nothing to negotiate, because by that point, by the time that second note was written and sent, there was nothing left to offer in return for payment. The thing that had been taken was gone. And the people who took it sent a note to explain that it was not their fault. The note was not a negotiation. It was a disclosure, and in the world of kidnapping investigations, a disclosure without a demand is one of the most unusual and difficult communications an investigative team can receive, because it removes the primary lever available to negotiators. Think about what that means for the investigation as it has unfolded. What does a family do when they receive a note saying their mother is dead and buried? What do they say publicly when the FBI is watching every word they put out? What do they say to the people who sent the note, the people who still know where she is, to keep them talking? If the second note arrived before the Savannah Instagram video, and the timing of her response strongly suggests it did, then Savannah Guthrie recorded that video already knowing or believing that her mother was dead. We received your message and we understand. That is not the language of a daughter bargaining for a living mother's return. That is the language of a daughter who has just been told something devastating and is trying to keep a line of communication open with the people who did it, because the alternative is silence and nothing. To understand what these notes mean in the context of how kidnapping investigations actually work, you need to hear from someone who has spent a career inside exactly this kind of case. Steve Moore is a retired FBI supervisory special agent who worked kidnapping and hostage cases during his time at the Bureau. He has sat in the room where ransom notes get analyzed by behavioral scientists and profilers who spend careers reading exactly this kind of communication, noting misspellings, line pressure in handwritten notes, vocabulary patterns, the specific way different people phrase demands versus threats versus explanations. He has compared notes across multiple cases, separating genuine communications from fakes, categorizing by sender, building the psychological picture of who is on the other end of an envelope. He knows what genuine notes look like, the specific details that only someone with direct knowledge of the victim would include, the consistency of voice and vocabulary across multiple communications from the same sender, the behavioral signatures that behavioral scientists catalog and compare across databases of prior kidnapping communications. He knows what fake notes look like too. The way someone who read about a case online tries to replicate the urgency without the specificity, the missing details, the broad language that could apply to any case. And he knows what the difference between them reveals about who is sending them and what they actually have. On the question of whether any of these notes are real, Moore said he remains skeptical about all of them. Not dismissive, skeptical, the professional posture of someone who has seen fake notes inserted into every major kidnapping case he has ever worked, because high-profile cases attract people who want to be part of the story even when they had nothing to do with it. And then he said something specific that deserves to sit with you. He believes 2, maybe 3 of the notes are likely genuine. Not all of them. A minority. The rest, in his assessment, are the scavengers and vultures that appear in every high-profile case. People who see a tragedy playing out in public and insert themselves into it for reasons that have nothing to do with Nancy Guthrie. That distinction matters enormously for how this investigation is being run right now. Because if only 2 or 3 notes are genuine, and the investigators have spent months sorting the real from the fake, then every conclusion drawn from the genuine notes carries enormous weight. And if the confirmed second note, the one that said buried with nature, is among the genuine ones, then the picture it paints is real. The people who took Nancy Guthrie believe she is dead, believe it was unintentional, and sent a note saying so rather than continuing to negotiate. There has been reporting from other outlets suggesting the second note contained an apology. The source close to the investigation is specific. It did not contain a direct apology. It indicated the death was unintentional. Those are different things, and Moore explained exactly why the difference matters. In his entire career working kidnapping cases, Moore said he has not heard of a kidnapper apologizing, except pre-sentencing, when the legal calculus has already shifted entirely and a reduced sentence is on the table. During an active kidnapping, during a live negotiation, an apology would be, in his words, extremely unusual. Not categorically impossible. He acknowledged that people who take someone for ransom sometimes realize, in the middle of it, the gravity of what they have done. Especially if something goes wrong. Especially if the person is harmed or dies. But an apology in a note changes the entire investigative posture. It signals a psychological shift that opens new avenues of approach. An apology from an active kidnapper would be, in his words, extremely unusual. Not impossible. He acknowledged that people who take someone for ransom sometimes realize the gravity of what they have done and feel genuine remorse, particularly if something goes wrong and the person is harmed or dies. But an apology changes everything about how investigators read the communication. It suggests a psychological shift in the perpetrator, a new vulnerability, a potential avenue of approach. What would an apology actually tell investigators about the person who sent it? Moore was direct. It would change the entire psychological profile. It would suggest remorse, a shift in intent, a person who is frightened of what they have done. Someone who might be reachable, negotiable, potentially willing to cooperate if approached correctly. What Moore described instead is something more disturbing than an apology. He said the notes as a whole did not give him anything that convinced him the kidnappers had proof of life or that they were taking a conciliatory tone. He said a good kidnapper, and these are not good kidnappers in his assessment, would be stern but would give hope. These notes, in his read, destroyed hope and replaced it with false bravado. Because by the time the second note arrived, he believes they no longer had anything to trade. Buried with nature. Not intentional. No direct apology. That is not the language of someone negotiating a price or pressing for a deadline. That is not the language of a threat or a demand or a tactical move designed to extract maximum payment before releasing a captive. That is the language of someone explaining, someone who did something that went wrong, who felt compelled to communicate that it was not the plan, and who stopped short of the word sorry. What kind of person does that? What kind of person takes an 84-year-old woman from her home, and then sends a note to a television station to explain that her death was not intentional? Moore was direct about the proof of life question, and it is not a technical detail or an investigative formality. It is the most important analytical framework for understanding everything that has happened in this case since Nancy disappeared. Every note, every search, every press conference, every tip and dead end and extended silence from Pima County orbits around it. Was there ever a moment when she could have been photographed alive and delivered back? And if the answer is no, if they never provided proof of life because by the time the notes were sent there was no living person to photograph, then everything that followed was aftermath, not negotiation. Did the people who took Nancy Guthrie ever have the ability to prove she was alive? And if the answer is no, if proof of life was never provided because there was never anything to provide, then everything that followed, including the second note, is the aftermath of a crime that went wrong before the first negotiation ever began. In kidnapping negotiations, proof of life is not a procedural step or a formality. It is the foundational requirement before any other step can meaningfully happen. Without it, you are not conducting a negotiation for a living person. You are conducting a negotiation for information, for a location, for details about what happened, for the specific knowledge that only the people who took her possess. And the difference between those two negotiations is the difference between a case that ends with a reunion and a case that ends with a burial. That shift, from negotiating for a person to negotiating for information about what happened to them, is the hardest moment in any kidnapping investigation. It is the moment more described as the room going silent. It tells the family that the person is alive. It tells investigators that there is a living person to negotiate for. And critically, it tells both sides that there is something real to trade. Without proof of life, you are not negotiating for a person. You are negotiating for information about what happened to them. The kidnappers in this case never provided proof of life. Not once. Not in any of the notes. Not in any form that the Guthrie family or investigators could verify. Moore said what that typically means statistically across the cases he has worked, not as a theory but as a pattern observed across dozens of investigations. When someone will not provide proof of life, they usually no longer have anything to trade. He described the moment when investigators sit down with a family and have that specific conversation. The one where the absence of proof of life, and what it statistically means, gets spoken out loud for the first time. The room goes silent, he said. Except for sobs. He said it is like watching someone receive a diagnosis they were not expecting, the kind where the doctor says, "Are you sitting down?" before continuing. He said it never stops being hard no matter how many times you have been in that room. And he said the families in that moment often cannot accept the statistical reality because acceptance feels like abandonment, like deciding that their person does not matter enough to keep fighting for. He said some families never reach it. He said he understood exactly why. He said you cannot ask a family under that kind of pressure to think in probabilities when every instinct they have says refuse to stop, refuse to accept, refuse to go home without her. He described it as something like the stages of grief, anger, frustration, the desperate bargaining of someone who says they do not care if they spend every last dollar they have, they are not going to face their mother in the afterlife having failed to do everything possible. He said it is nearly impossible to get a family under that kind of pressure to think rationally about probability and precedent. And he said he understands why. Ask yourself what it would take for a kidnapper to refuse to provide proof of life if the person were alive. What would be the reason? What would be the logic? What would stop someone from taking a 30-second video of an alive person and sending it to collect millions of dollars in return? Proof of life is easy to obtain. It takes 30 seconds. It requires nothing that would expose the kidnapper's location or identity. There is no logical reason to withhold it if the person is alive and you want money for their return. The only logical reason to withhold it is if you cannot provide it, because there is no living person to photograph, no voice to record, no hand to hold up today's newspaper. The Guthrie family asked. The FBI asked. The answer, across months of notes and silence and false starts, was never proof of life. And now a source close to the investigation has confirmed what the second note said about why. Here is a detail that surfaced publicly this week and that Moore addressed directly, because it says something important about how this investigation has been handled and where it may be going. TMZ reported that they approached the FBI with a proposal. They wanted to pay the Bitcoin ransom themselves as part of a documentary, and asked the FBI how the agency would feel about it. This is not a minor footnote. A media organization with a national platform told the FBI they were considering inserting themselves as financial actors in an active kidnapping case, paying real money in cryptocurrency to a person or persons who may have been involved in abducting an 84-year-old woman, and framing the whole thing as documentary content. Moore's reaction was direct. There is not a single positive thing that could come out of that from a law enforcement perspective. Not one. Partnering with TMZ to catch a kidnapper with everything playing out publicly in real time, is in his words like playing Russian roulette with a full gun. The FBI's response, according to TMZ, was to call the idea interesting and say they would get back to them. They have not gotten back to them. Moore declined to speculate on what resources the FBI has for paying ransoms and tracing the result, saying only that the Bureau has the appropriate resources to do what needs to be done, and that providing further detail would compromise their operational capacity going forward. The careful non-answer of someone who knows exactly what he is not saying. TMZ says the FBI has been responsive throughout this case, and then, on this specific question, went silent. Moore's read on this was blunt and he did not hedge it. He has been involved in enough of these situations to have strong instincts about what investigative partnerships work and what ones introduce risk without upside. He said partnering with TMZ to catch a kidnapper, with everything playing out publicly, has not a single positive thing going for it from a law enforcement perspective. He said if the FBI thought paying the ransom would get Nancy back, they would not be asking TMZ for a contribution. The federal government takes in more in taxes in a few days than any media organization could provide, and the resources for an investigation of this magnitude do not come from celebrity news outlets. And he said if the FBI has gone quiet on this specific question, it is not a bureaucratic oversight. The FBI does not ghost people by accident. The FBI has been responsive throughout this case, as TMZ itself acknowledged. Silence on a specific inquiry from an agency that has been communicating throughout is a deliberate choice, and the question worth asking is what that choice is protecting. What does FBI silence on a specific question mean when the agency has been responsive throughout? What does interesting mean as a response to a proposal, followed by weeks of no follow-up? What that choice means is not definitively knowable from the outside. But Moore's framework provides one strong possibility. If the FBI's working theory has shifted from active negotiation toward a case that is now primarily about identifying and prosecuting the people responsible, then the calculus around paying ransom changes entirely. You do not pay to get someone back if you believe they are no longer alive to return. You may consider whether payment creates a traceable trail to the perpetrators. But you do not do it publicly, and you do not do it with TMZ. Go back and watch the Instagram video Savannah Guthrie posted after the second note arrived. Watch it now, knowing what that note said. How do those words land differently? What does "we understand" mean to you now that you know what the note told her to understand? She said, and these are her exact words, chosen deliberately, recorded publicly, addressed to the people who had sent the note. "We received your message and we understand. We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her. This is the only way we will have peace. This is very valuable to us and we will pay. We received your message and we understand." That sentence, in context, is not the language of a daughter who does not know what the note contained. The FBI does not let families respond to ransom notes without guidance. Every word in that video was considered, reviewed, probably approved by the FBI before she recorded it. The FBI does not let families improvise their public responses to ransom notes in active investigations. "We understand" is an acknowledgement, not of a demand, not of a price, but of the specific information in the note. Information that, according to the source close to this investigation, said her mother was dead. The confirmation from a source close to the investigation was unambiguous. The note said her mother was dead. "We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her." Parse that sentence against what she knew when she recorded it. She is not asking for a living person. She is asking for her mother, whatever form that return takes. "So that we can celebrate with her" is not the language of someone expecting a reunion. It is the language of someone asking to be given the chance to say goodbye properly. That is a plea for a body. For remains. For the physical presence of a person even at the very end. Savannah Guthrie, in that video, was asking the people who killed her mother to at least tell them where she was. "We will pay," said after a note telling them she was gone, not to buy her back because there was nothing left to buy back, but to keep the door open. To keep whoever wrote the note from vanishing entirely. To maintain a channel of communication that might eventually lead to a location. That final sentence in Savannah's video, "we will pay," was not a ransom offer in any conventional sense. There was nothing left to pay for. It was the last tool a family had left to keep talking to the people who could tell them where their mother was. A signal. A door held open by its hinges, barely, because closing it entirely meant never finding out. Never knowing what "buried with nature" actually referred to. Never having a location. Never having something to bring home. To keep the perpetrators talking. To try to get something back when there was nothing left to negotiate for. Moore said something quietly devastating about this moment. He described what happens in the room when investigators tell a family that the absence of proof of life statistically means the person is gone. He said it is when the room goes silent except for sobs. He said it is like the stages of grief, anger, frustration, denial, and then acceptance, which some families never reach. He said the rational calculation is impossible to make when a family is inside that grief. When every instinct says pay anything, do everything, leave no stone unturned. Savannah Guthrie recorded a video. She chose every word carefully, with the FBI watching and probably advising on every syllable. She said, "We understand" to the people who had just told her in writing that her mother was dead. She said, "We will pay" to to people she had no way to reach directly, as the only way to keep a door open that was already almost completely closed. And she said it publicly on Instagram, because the notes went to a television station rather than to the family directly, which means the only way to respond was publicly. Think about what that says about the people who sent the notes. They created a situation where a daughter had to grieve her mother in code, in public, in a carefully worded video, because that was the only channel available to respond to them. The second note said Nancy Guthrie died. That she was buried with nature. That it was not intentional. There was no direct apology, and more said that absence matters because an apology would have signaled something actionable. Remorse. A psychological opening. Instead, what was sent was a disclosure. Something happened, she is gone, it was not meant to go this way. A disclosure without accountability, from people who took an 84-year-old woman from her home and then sent a written disclosure to a television station to explain that things went wrong. The person or people who sent that note have still not been publicly identified. The surveillance footage from Nancy's home, footage that has been circulated nationally, studied by investigators and the public for more than 135 days, put on television screens across the country, still shows someone who has not been publicly named. Not charged. Not arrested. Not confirmed. Somewhere in the United States, the person on that footage is living. And according to the second note, they know exactly where Nancy Guthrie is buried. The Mariposa search south of Nogales came up empty. The task force continues to work in silence. Almost no public updates, almost no press conferences, almost no indication of forward motion beyond the occasional confirmation that the investigation is active. While a family waits for the only thing a note that says buried with nature can point toward. A specific location, a piece of land, a place where Nancy Guthrie was put and where she may still be. The Mariposa search south of Nogales came up empty. The task force continues to work in silence. Moore believes 2, maybe 3 of the notes are genuine, a minority of the total communications that have surfaced publicly in this case, not the majority. He said if you put 10 FBI agents in a room with all of them, 8 out of 10 would agree on which 2 or 3 carry the specific details, the consistent voice, and the behavioral signatures of someone with direct knowledge of what happened to Nancy. The other 2 might disagree. That disagreement does not disappear. It becomes part of the file, part of the investigative record, part of the case that gets argued through rigorously when prosecution eventually happens and every note gets entered into evidence. He believes the rest are exactly what he has seen in every major kidnapping he has ever worked. Opportunists, attention seekers, people who send fake notes because they are fascinated by the case, because they want to feel powerful, because they saw it on the news and thought they could add something. People who insert themselves into a tragedy because they want to be part of something large. The same psychology that produces fraudulent ransom schemes like the one that got a California man arrested for exploiting the Guthrie family's grief. In his words, after the predators leave, the scavengers arrive. The crows. The vultures. The people trying to consume whatever possibility remains. He believes the people who sent the genuine notes are amateurs who thought they were smarter than they were, who sent notes to television stations instead of communicating privately, who used public channels that any trained investigator can analyze and trace, who destroyed hope when a better criminal would have given just enough to keep negotiating. He does not believe there is any ongoing active communication between the perpetrators and investigators or the family. He believes the perpetrators have gone to ground, that whoever sent these communications has looked at how this played out and gone quiet, either because the public attention scared them, because the investigation got close enough to make continued contact dangerous, or because they believe they have nothing more to gain from communicating. Gone to ground is not the same as invisible. The FBI does not close its files when a suspect goes quiet. It works backward from what it has, the language, the delivery method, the timing, the specific phrase, buried with nature, toward a name. But going to ground is not the same as disappearing. It is not the same as being unfindable. It is not the same as having covered every trail. Amateur criminals who thought they were smarter than they were, who sent notes to television stations instead of communicating directly, who used public channels any trained investigator can analyze, who destroyed hope when they should have given just enough to keep negotiating. Amateurs leave traces. They make mistakes in how they phrase things. They use vocabulary that places them. They make choices about delivery that narrow the pool of who they could be. And the FBI has been collecting those traces for more than 135 days, building the profile of someone who wrote the words, buried with nature, and thought sending it to a television station was an acceptable way to communicate with a grieving family. But someone buried Nancy Guthrie with nature. Someone knows where she is. Someone wrote those words and sent them to a television station rather than to a family directly, and what does that tell you about who these people are? What does it tell you about their competence, their planning, their understanding of how kidnapping investigations work? Somewhere in the area around Tucson or somewhere else entirely that has not yet surfaced in this investigation, there is a location that the people who sent that note know and that investigators have not yet confirmed. The note gave the family and the FBI one piece of information that everything else has failed to provide: a direction. She is somewhere. The note said so. Written by someone, sent to a television station, received and confirmed and analyzed by the FBI and the Guthrie family while the rest of the world watched Savannah's Instagram video and wondered what she had been told. The people who know where Nancy Guthrie is buried have not yet been found. But they sent a note. And notes leave traces, in language, in behavioral patterns, in vocabulary and sentence structure, and the specific way a person phrases guilt without accepting responsibility, in whatever postmark or delivery method or digital fingerprint accompanied the paper. The FBI has those traces. Behavioral scientists have analyzed them. The investigation continues. And the communication that said "buried with nature" is the most specific piece of information this case has produced. If you know anything about the person on the surveillance footage from Nancy's home, about the notes and who sent them, about anyone who discussed Nancy Guthrie or the Guthrie family in the context of money or cryptocurrency or leverage in the months before the abduction, about any location in or around Tucson that might be consistent with someone being buried in a natural area, contact the FBI. 1-800-CALL-FBI. The note said she was buried with nature. Someone knows where that is. And someone in their life may know something without realizing it matters. 1-800-CALL-FBI. Every tip is still being processed. The family is still waiting. And the note that changed everything is already in investigators' hands. Subscribe if you are not already here. Turn on your notifications. A source close to this investigation confirmed what that second communication said, directly, specifically, on the record, with proximity to the case that makes this confirmation significant rather than speculative. Steve Moore says 2 or 3 of the notes are real, that the people who sent them are amateurs who thought they were smarter than they were, and that the FBI is not second-guessing itself about anything that might have led to a different outcome. And somewhere out there, the person who wrote the words, "buried with nature," knows exactly where Nancy Guthrie is. They have not been found. But they sent a note. And notes are evidence. When the next development breaks, you need to already be watching. The people who know exactly where she is have not yet been found. But they sent their communications to a television station. They used public channels. They left language behind, specific, traceable language, with behavioral signatures that trained analysts have been studying for more than 135 days. Somewhere in that accumulated evidence, in the vocabulary they chose and the phrasing they used and the specific way a person writes guilt without accepting responsibility, is the information that will eventually lead to a name. And from a name to a location. And from a location to Nancy Guthrie. This is Missing People Files. A source confirmed the second communication. Steve Moore said 2 or 3 are real. And somewhere in the ground, in a natural area that the person who wrote those words knows by name, Nancy Guthrie is waiting to be found.